Welcome to another broadcast of MindYourHealthcast.com. This is the third and final session on the pharmaceutical industry, which is basically what we were talking about. But it's not just the pharmaceutical, it's the whole state of health in the country and ultimately in the world, and what really is going on and where we've gotten to, and all of the uses, abuses, and misuses of the pharmaceutical field, and the public being drawn into and becoming a part of the whole problem. It's kind of become like an Alice in Wonderland. Everything you look at, it's different from what it appears to be, and everything is in reverse. It makes you think of Alice when she was brought before the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, and the Queen said, "Off with her head." And she said, "You can't cut my head off until I've had a trial." And she says, "Well, cut your head off, then we'll have the trial." So that's kind of the way everything is. It's topsy-turvy, upside down. What has been called scientific medicine has become anything but scientific. In fact, it's brought to mind the possibility of a good book called The Medical Cult, because it's almost become a cult now. Everybody walks about in fear. They're afraid if they don't have their pills, they're going to die, because they've been told that by the pharmaceuticals, they've been told that by the doctors, and they begin to believe it. And of course, you know there is such a thing as the placebo and nocebo effect. Placebo meaning people think something's going to help and they get better because they believed it was going to help, and nocebo meaning they get sick because they believed that they were going to get sick and they got sick. And that is kind of where we've gotten to, is that everybody feels dependent. Everybody goes into a tither about, uh-oh, we may not have money to pay for all of our drugs. What happens if Medicare fails? What happens if we run out of money? We're all going to die. I mean, that basically is where we have been led to and led to believe. Now, if you remember my very first opening broadcast, and if you haven't watched it, you really should watch them all in sequence, we talked about the fact that way back, the head of Merck told Fortune that their next market that they wanted to hit was well people. Now, if you can believe that there's integrity in a company who wants to convince people that aren't sick that they need to take their drugs, you know, that's a pretty good sell. I always said that Adolf Hitler, and I may have said this before, but I'm going to say it again, was able to convince a whole nation that tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and fair-skinned people were the master race, and he was short with dark hair, dark skin, and dark eyes, and nobody seemed to notice. And he led a whole nation into disaster because of his deceptions. And I'm seeing that that's where we've gotten to with the medical establishment today, and I'm not indicting individual doctors, because there are people who go into medicine with the purpose of helping people. Now, some of them eventually find out that what they're doing isn't getting people well, and they start making a turnaround, looking for other ways. Many of those doctors become pretty good at taking people that otherwise probably would have died and getting them turned around because they take them away from the drugs. However, those doctors sometimes suffer some pretty nasty consequences for daring to do that. And I've known several that have either lost their license or came close because they had law officials charge in with guns drawn and take their files and take their computer hard drives and hold everybody at gunpoint as though they were some hardened criminal, and their crime was that they were getting a whole lot of people better, and they were doing it without all of the prescription drugs that are out there today. Now, I mentioned before that on any given month, about 15 to 18,000 prescription drugs are circulating. Now, they take off a few hundred and sometimes more in a month, and they put another few hundred back in, but at any given time, we now have somewhere around 15 to 18,000 drugs circulating. Now, it's interesting because I think I've mentioned before, you may or may not remember, but the Merck manual, which was put out and has been put out since the 1800s, is a little handbook for doctors. Right now, the Merck manual is probably 2.5 inches thick, and what it has is a list of all the so-called diagnosed diseases and what their symptoms are, and if they know what may be behind it, and what the recommended treatments are for it. And so it's called the Merck Manual. And years ago, they had a new edition came out, and it was commemorating, it was actually the late 1900s, 1998 if I recall, is that they came out with a memorial edition of the original one way back in the 1800s. And so it was about this thick, and I counted 700 and some substances that were in that book, and that was the sum total of the materia medica at that point. Now, most of those were either herbs or minerals or mineral compounds of some sort, and none of those were manufactured prescription drugs. Now, sometimes they would take an herb and concentrate something out of it, but beyond that, that's what they had. So the whole materia medica could fit in your hip pocket, and many of the early historians of medicine talked about the fact that the real highest purpose of a physician back in those days was to diagnose and prognosticate, not really to treat, because they really didn't have a lot to treat with. But you know, the interesting thing about it was that people were healthier back then than they are now, and they didn't have all that. So if you go back and study the history, which I've done a lot of, and especially recently since I'm doing these broadcasts, I did a lot more, it's interesting to see how we have gotten to where we are today, that everybody in the world believes they have to be taking one to several drugs every day their whole life or they're going to die. You know, that paradigm is false, but we've been led to believe it. Now, I mentioned the last time that we were talking a bit about the condition of the country, medicine, health, at the turn of the century, and the turn of the century would be from the 1800s to the 1900s, which would be the 20th century. And at that period of time, things were pretty bad as far as what was out there. We were going to start, that was the beginning of us starting to really go downhill. Previous to all of that, people weren't doing too bad. Now, there were some dirt diseases, meaning we had contaminated water supplies, we did not have good disposal of sewage and garbage and a lot of things. So when people did get sick, it was things like typhoid, cholera, some of those types of illnesses, tuberculosis, which I call dirt diseases, meaning the dirty living, contamination. Used to be, you know, before the public water supplies, that people in little towns pretty much tapped the same vein of water in the town. So and the way they tapped it is they had a well. And so, unfortunately, they also had outside toilets. And so if somebody got typhoid, it got into the excretion from that person in the outside toilet, and many times it could soak down through the ground into the water supply, and so the people's wells would all become contaminated with typhoid. And so those were the kind of things that were happening, but those were solvable by just cleaning things up. And that's what happened when we improved health. It was because we were cleaning up and getting rid of the dirt. Now, unfortunately, many of those illnesses have come back again, and you don't hear too much about it, and medicine doesn't like to talk too much about it. But we've seen a return of bubonic plague, we've seen a return of leprosy, we've seen a return of typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis. All of these things are coming back because now our society has gotten choked up with garbage and refuse and contamination again, because we've got the whole process of how we keep clean has gotten corrupted, and so now we're starting to see some of that come back again. But those are more easily taken care of because a cleanup does a good job. But there's a deeper problem that was going on, at the turn of the century that caused a lot of things to happen. One was, of course, that this country was growing. There was a lot of industrialization taking place. There were a lot of people immigrating into the country, and as the especially concentrations of population like New York City and Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles, St. Louis, a lot of these big cities were having concentrations of people. So we had people migrating from farms coming into town to work in industry. And as they were doing that, this transition was occurring. They weren't growing their own food, and they weren't growing it in good soil. What was happening is there opened up a market because of this concentration of population. There opened up a market for food processing companies to produce the food for people rather than growing it themselves on their own farm in good soil. They were now going to a store and purchasing food, so the whole market for processed food started to elevate tremendously. And it also meant that the growers who were growing the food had limited land. In other words, the lands that they owned to grow on, they started overgrowing until the point they depleted the soil. So now you're having a depletion of soil, and you're having a processing of food that didn't take place before. They weren't processing it that much. So now they're processing it. They're knocking out minerals. They took flour, for example, and they stripped all of the nutrients out of it and left a white powder of mostly carbohydrate and a little protein. And then they turned around and threw 2 or 3 artificial vitamins that they had learned about back into it and called it enriched flour. So now people are thinking, wow, I'm getting something better, but they didn't come even close to what was in the grain originally had it been a whole grain flour. But people liked the looks of it. They liked the looks of the white bread that you could bake with it. But it also was very good to make paste to make paper maches, because it really sticks well when that gets wet and then it sets up. So you kind of can imagine what it can do into the innards of a person eating a lot of it. But anyhow, you know, the poor people who lived on the farm had to eat this old dark bread made with all this whole grain. And here the city people who had a lot of money, they could go out the store and buy this nice white-looking bread that was packaged up nice, and they didn't have to fuss with it, and wow, this was a sign of affluence. However, all of this ended up that you're growing food with no nutrients in it because they've depleted the soils. You're processing it on top of it and stripping even more out if there's anything left. And they package it up really pretty. They add a good bit of sugar, oil, and salt, and it tastes pretty good. And so people thought they were getting more. But the fact is they were getting less. So what was happening is you were starting to get deficiency diseases developing, and many times weren't even recognized because no one knew what would happen if you stripped all these minerals out, and especially a lot of the very critical trace elements. They didn't know what even the symptoms were. They had known what beriberi and pellagra and scurvy and some of the major vitamin deficiencies were, but they had no idea what the symptoms were of deficiencies of key minerals, which extremely important in the body as catalysts to make everything work. So at any rate, that was one problem. Second problem was that the food processors were making a mess of the food. I mean, really bad. The meat processors were putting rotten meat, and they were putting all kinds of garbage and debris and chopping it all up in the meat, and it was terrible. And you know, rotting meat basically is ptomaine, and ptomaine poisoning can be very bad. But anyhow, especially the big stockyards in Chicago were pumping all this stuff out, and the conditions under which it was being done, where they were butchering and they were packaging, were terrible. Dirty, contaminated, rats running around, full of insects, and still today, you know, when you go out and buy packaged lunch meat, the FDA allows a certain percentage of ground up insects to be in that, and when you buy black pepper, they allow a certain amount of ground up rat feces, because rats for some reason have an affinity for the pepper. They allow a certain amount of ground up rat feces to be acceptable in the pepper you buy. And I found out a lot of this from a company who sold paint and so forth to food processors, and they kind of got their eyes opened as to what even today is done under FDA supervision. But then there was no supervision, so they could throw anything into it and sell it and make a lot of money off of it, and the people had no choice. If they were no longer on the farm, they were in the city, so they had to go to the market to buy their meat and to buy their food. And so it was really got to be a mess. And then on top of it, you had what drugs were out there. There was a lot of deception going on. They would throw morphine, codeine, cannabis, which is, of course, marijuana or hemp. They would throw all this stuff in these patent drugs, they were called, because there were no prescription drugs at that point. They would throw these patent drugs, they'd throw all this stuff in, and they wouldn't put it on the label, and they were even selling it to children and infants with opium or morphine in it. And, of course, it would make the baby quit crying because they were drugged. But it wasn't so good for their health. So that was kind of the condition that was in existence. Now, there was a chemist from the Department of Agriculture by the name of Dr. Harvey Washington. His last name just went, Wiley was his name, W-I-L-E-Y. He was a chemist, had a PhD in chemistry. He also had a medical degree, had been trained both in medicine and chemistry heavily. And he worked for the Department of Agriculture, and his specialty was food chemistry. So as he was analyzing the food, he was one of the first ones to recognize about all the contamination and adulteration, as he called it, both of food and drugs. He thought this was terrible. And, of course, the depletion of the soil he was beginning to recognize was a problem. And so he actually, along with a lot of other doctors, started pushing to the U.S. Congress to pass some kind of regulatory law that would give standards so that they could stop the contaminated products being put out. And they called it being mislabeled or misbranded. They, in the meats, if they throw all kind of garbage in it, they didn't have to reveal what they put in it. They could throw it all in and package it up, and people wouldn't know the difference. The only time they would know there was a problem is if they got sick when they ate ptomaine from the rotting meat that got thrown in, and they would take diseased animals, of course, and kill them and chop up all the cancerous tumors and everything else, and it would all be in the meat. So this became a major problem. Now, it's almost there again, I hate to say, because the supervision is very poor, and the food processors are getting away with a lot again today, even with regulation. So anyhow, they tried to get this law passed, and they weren't successful. What happened is that there was so much money being made by the food processors and the growers and the drug companies that they were able to influence members of Congress, not all of them, but enough of them, of the key people, they influenced them to keep from getting any laws passed to regulate. So they wanted to have free reign to do whatever they wanted to. And so Wiley was quite concerned about the misbranding or mislabeling, and also the denaturing of the food, because he realized this is a major health problem. So finally, there was an author, a writer, who got wind of what was going on with the meat industry in particular, and he went to Chicago and looked into what was happening. And so as a consequence of that, he ended up writing a book, a fictional book, but factual in the sense that he wrote in there what they were doing, and he gave a copy, or somebody gave a copy of it, to President Theodore Roosevelt, who up to this point had been kind of lukewarm about passing any kind of federal regulation. And so when he read that book, he was appalled at what he read and started looking into it. So he went to Congress and said, we have to have a law passed. Well, of course, the lobbyists were saying, you don't need regulation. We're doing fine. We'll regulate ourselves. You don't have to come in and inspect our plants and see that we're doing it okay. We'll assure you that we're going to regulate ourselves and we're going to take care of it, which is really where we are today about. Anyhow, it ended up that the Congress still drugged their feet, so he released some documents to the public, President Roosevelt did, about the practices at the stockyard, and boy, that was going to cut their business in a hurry. And so Congress did pass, on June the 30th, 1906, the first Pure Food and Drug Act. And interestingly, this Dr. Wiley, who was one of the crusaders for it, but had been unsuccessful in getting anything passed, ended up being the first head of the Pure Food and Drug Act to administer it. Now, he got himself into trouble right away because he started going out and taking samples of all the manufactured food, the processed food, and taking them into the laboratory and testing them, and consequently, he would then have the power, under the new legislation, to go out and declare it unfit for human consumption and to confiscate it. And so, wow, did the food processors get upset about that. So before it was all done, everything got softened, and he was so pressured he finally left in disgust that nothing, we're getting right back where we started. And that's basically what's happened to today. We have token inspections, and it really doesn't amount to anything. But it was an attempt by well-meaning doctors and well-meaning legislators to get something passed that would kind of try to guarantee safe and uncontaminated food and mislabeled drugs. Now when you put out a drug, at that point you had to prove that you had labeled it properly, because he could take it in the lab and analyze it, and if it wasn't labeled properly, then they were in violation. So there were fines and even imprisonment depending on the nature and the severity of the violations. So it worked a little bit for a while, but over the years it's kind of died down until we've kind of drifted right back to where we were before. But so I don't know what happened to Wiley. I think he did do some writing and he did do some talking, but I think he became very disillusioned that we were ever going to regulate and control these major manufacturers who were making a fortune putting out poor quality food. And of course we still have it today, and it's interesting that by the 30s, 20s and 30s, many of the doctors were beginning to realize that the illnesses that people had were deficiency illnesses. Now you have to think about that. The symptoms can be very dramatic of deficiency. Some of the vitamin deficiencies were really terrible. Deformation of the bone structure, deformation of the whole frame of the body. All kinds of terrible skin problems, degenerative cardiovascular. It really had gotten bad. Now, I was able to find, all the way from Australia, but it was actually done in the U.S., a book that was published way back in 1943 originally. And it was called The National Malnutrition by a Dr. D.T. Quigley, M.D., and he wrote about what the condition was. Now here we're talking in the 40s, and he had gone through the 30s and 40s. So he puts out this book, and if you read it, and it is available, you can get it online, but it has to ultimately come from Australia. And it was published by the Lee Foundation for Nutritional Research out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. See, there's some good things come out of Wisconsin. Anyhow, he looked at a study that was done, and he's talking about deficiencies. In other words, from the malnutrition, he's talking about deficiencies in the food. And he says, the studies made by the author of 2,707 cases of patients suffering with tumors, cancers, stomach ulcers, colitis, constipation, neuritis, arthritis, heart disease, chronic headaches, high and low blood pressure, disclosed the fact that this group as a group was consuming 55% white flour products, bread, cookies, cakes, pastries, pancakes, biscuits, and muffins. The sugar taken by the group, represented by candy, marmalade, preserves, jellies, jams, and canned goods containing heavy sugar syrups, added another 20% to the devitalized, demineralized, devitaminized foods. And this is a report that was made by a study group and turned over for actually a society out of Cleveland, and that was in 1934. Now, does this sound familiar? I mean, listen to the diseases. Tumors, cancers, stomach ulcers, colitis, constipation, neuritis, arthritis, heart disease, chronic headaches, and high and low blood pressure. Do those sound familiar? We're talking about deficiency issues. Now, what are people being treated with today with drugs? Isn't it the same list of problems? This started way back at the turn of the century, and by the 20s and 30s was epidemic. And you remember I mentioned that a Dr. Northen, Northen, became so concerned that he started looking into the whole issue of nutrition and minerals and vitamins in food and realized that there was a terrible problem. They tried correcting it with supplements, which help some, but it's only temporary because we have to get the basic nutrients from our food, which has to come from good soil. So as time went on, he went back to the soil and realized the soil was depleted. That's why we had food that was devitalized and demineralized and devitaminized. And therefore, those were the illnesses that were being caused. Now, if your illness is caused by a deficiency in the food, how is taking a drug ever going to correct the problem? And of course it doesn't. When you're on high blood pressure medication, are they ever going to take you off of it? No. Why? Because they haven't solved the problem. They've given you a Band-Aid to try to force it down, and when they do, the drug has its own adverse effects. So what's it going to do? It's going to disturb other issues in the body and create further problems. However, not to worry, because now they're going to make another drug to offset those symptoms that are being caused by that drug and the continued decline in health that's being created because you haven't solved the original problem. Now, I don't know if this is beginning to register or not. I'm hoping it is. We're spending now almost $1 trillion to try to Band-Aid symptoms that are caused by deficiencies. I mean, here's the list. This is way back in 1934. But you know, back in the 1800s, the old medical books never talked about cardiovascular disease because there wasn't any then. And they rarely ever talked about cancer because it was so rare that anybody ever got cancer that it wasn't worthy of spending a lot of time talking about. Now today, 1 in every other person is going to have cancer according to medical establishment's own numbers. 1 in every 2 people, half of the people, are going to have cancer. We are supposed to be the most advanced nation in the world, we claim, and we're supposed to have the most advanced medicine in the world, we claim, but yet, it's now down to 1 or every other person is going to have cancer. Are we getting better? Is it improving? That's why we have a $1 trillion bill. Because remember, I mentioned before when I talked about cancer, today every cancer patient, on the average, brings in about $1 million of cost and, of course, income. It's cost to the public and it's income to the medical industry. But is it better? President Nixon, years and years and years ago, declared a war on cancer. And of course I laugh about all these wars and battles and all that. It's not against cancer, it's against malnutrition. That's where we should be putting our money and our time and our effort, and that's what we should be looking into, is malnutrition. People are dying of malnutrition and or medical procedures and drugs trying to manage the symptoms of malnutrition. I don't know if it's sinking in or not. The people can be lackadaisical and flippant about their diet and the quality of the food, but the fact is when you eat a plate of denatured food that has no vitamins or minerals in it, or almost none, you're certainly not helping your health. And if you want to take pills to manage the symptoms that are created because you're suffering from malnutrition, you can do it, but it never ends, and can we afford it? And of course not. When we got $1 trillion sick bill in the country, we cannot afford the malnutrition. Can you imagine what would happen if we dropped the cost every year from $1 trillion to a few billion for the whole country. Look at all that extra money that's out there that could be put into replenishing the soil and putting out good food, and people could be basically healthy. I don't know if it's making sense to you or not, but I'm hoping if you don't get anything out of this whole thing, that you get two things. One is, we are sick because of malnutrition, and number two, we are being further destroyed by the medications that are being created to manage the symptoms of malnutrition. I mean, the evidence is all there. If you want to take the time to go back and read it, it's all there. You know, the document of Dr. Northern, about Dr. Northern, as one of the examples, that there was an article written about him way back in 1936, and it was read before the U.S. Congress in 1936. And they, in turn, actually had it reprinted as a U.S. government document. You still can find it online. I mentioned to you before, it's called Modern Miracle Men, and it's about the doctors who realized that malnutrition was the major problem. And Dr. Northern quit working in medicine so he could work in improving the soil to grow good food. But you know, that all fell by the wayside. None of the food processors and growers want to take the time to do crop rotations or to replenish the soil. They want to just keep throwing a little nitrogen in it with ammonia and throw a few key minerals so that the plant will grow, and they don't care whether all those trace elements and all those things that are necessary to be in the soil are there. And then they throw some pesticides on, because I mentioned before that basically the pests only eat sick plants. So they're growing unhealthy plants, and because they've got an insect problem, so then they have to put pesticides on, so then we get all of this. Now, are they solving the real problem? No. They're all figuring out, like Monsanto is now today, and I can say it because it's all over the place, that they are doing all the genetic engineering, and they're pushing for it, and they're actually genetically engineering plants that in the genes they produce pesticides inside the plant to try to keep the insects away. But guess what? We're eating those plants because they've been genetically altered. So we're eating the actual pesticide inside the plant. You can't get rid of it. You can't wash it off. So all these things are going on. And people sit by, get sick, or maybe everybody is so sick that they don't know. Now, if you take all this and then you add one more factor, which I've talked about many times, which is stress on top of that, then you have a really major problem, because you break down the body faster. It needs to rebuild. We don't have good products in our food for our body to rebuild, so we're building defective bodies. And it's just like there's a whole chain of things going on, and one relates to the next, to the next, to the next. It's a terrible situation we're in, and it is a crisis, I will admit that. But what are we doing about it? Basically, nothing except trying to produce more drugs. And everybody's afraid that they won't have the money to buy more of these drugs. But are we extending life, really? I mean, we're sometimes keeping bodies alive, being on life support, but is that extending life? Life would, to me, also involve having some level of health. And the worst part of it, it doesn't just stop there. It's now extended into the animal kingdom too, and so we have the sick animals. But you know, it's funny, because way back at the turn of the century, in the early part of the 20th century, in Europe there were a lot of studies done. I have a book, and I mentioned it before, called Soil, Grass, and Cancer. And they did studies showing that if the soil was deficient in key elements, minerals, then the grass was, and if the grass was, the animals that eating it got sick and got cancer and all that. And of course then the humans eating the grains and grasses growing on bad soil, and the animals who are also eating and growing on that, then the humans also are having the same problems. And so it's not something new. And the animals are sick today too. The average domestic animals are sick. When I was young, doctors of veterinary medicine treated farm animals either for birthing or for injuries from hitting barbed wire or whatever. They didn't even have an office. They worked out of their car and went out to the farms. And everybody who had dogs and cats and domestic animals never took them to a vet. They didn't need to be immunized. They didn't need to take all of the drugs and the antibiotics. And they didn't have all those diseases. They didn't have arthritis. They didn't have degenerative kidneys. They didn't have lupus. They didn't have dermatitis. They didn't have all these degenerative diseases that the animals now have. And all of that's come about because we've treated the animals the same way. We've made all these packaged foods that are worthless as far as having energy and nutrition in it. And so the animals, because of their deficiencies, are suffering deficiency symptoms. And so we've started doing the same thing with animals. We've watched the veterinary business grow from a doctor working out of his car going out to farms, now having big elaborate hospitals and clinics, and everybody getting their shots and coming in for the checkups and having their surgeries and having their tumors removed and doing all the same things done to humans. And it happened because we changed their diet. And we started feeding them worthless food, the same as humans are. Now, it is a terrible problem, and I don't know if I'm getting to you or not yet, but I'm sure hoping I am. Even one of the problems that's come about by modern medicine and drugs was the vaccination. And the reason I'm saying that is because I am talking about animals, and I had gotten a hold of a report. This came out of Purdue University School of Veterinary Medicine. And I've seen it myself, and I know that it happens, but they're quite concerned because they've done several studies to determine if vaccines can cause changes in the immune system of dogs that might lead to life-threatening immune-mediated diseases. They obviously conducted this research because concern already existed. And it was sponsored by a foundation called the Haywood Foundation, which itself was looking for evidence that such change in the human immune system might also be vaccine-induced. It found the evidence. The vaccinated, but not the non-vaccinated dogs in the Purdue studies developed autoantibodies to many of their own biochemicals, including fibronectin, laminin, DNA, albumin, cytochrome C, cardiolipin, and collagen. This means that the vaccinated dogs, but not the non-vaccinated dogs, were attacking their own fibronectin, which is involved in tissue repair, cell multiplication and growth, and differentiation between tissues and organs in a living organism. The vaccinated Purdue dogs also developed autoantibodies to laminin, which is involved in many cellular activities, including adhesion, spreading, differentiation, proliferation, and movement of cells. Vaccines thus appear to be capable of removing the natural intelligence of cells. It also found that the vaccinated dogs were developing antibodies to their own collagen. About 1/4 of all the protein in the body is collagen. Collagen provides structure to our bodies, protecting and supporting softer tissues and connecting them with the skeleton. It's no wonder the Canine Health Concern's 1997 study of 4,000 dogs showed a higher number of dogs developing mobility problems shortly after they were vaccinated. And they even wrote a book about it in 1997 called What Vets Don't Tell You About Vaccines. Perhaps most worryingly, the Purdue studies found that the vaccinated dogs had developed antibodies to their own DNA. Did the alarm bell sound? Did the scientific community call a halt to the vaccination program? No. Instead, they stuck their fingers in the air saying more research is needed to ascertain whether vaccines can cause genetic damage. Meanwhile, the dogs were found good homes, but no long-term follow-up has been conducted. But what they did find is that at the sites, and I'm not going to read you this whole article, but they found in the sites that the dogs in many cases produced tumors from the vaccine where the injection site was. And anyhow, both in cats and dogs. I was just seeing if there's anything else I should mention to you in here. I guess that's enough. But again, this is all available. You can go to Purdue University to their library of papers and research, and you can find all that. It's available. I know nobody wants to bother because they want to trust everybody and hope for the best and think that it's not a problem. So if it's doing it in animals, it's doing it in humans too, but they keep fighting that also. To me, the interesting thing about the whole vaccination issue is that if it's not dangerous, why did the drug companies back in the 60s that were pushing the vaccines go to the U.S. government and get a law passed that makes them exempt from being liable for damage from vaccines if they were safe. And they did. And you can't sue them directly. You have to go to a U.S. claims court. I mentioned that when we talked about vaccinations. You have to go to a U.S. claims court to file your claim. And there's a cap on it. And guess who gets to pay for it if you can prove your case? Of course, the public, not the pharmaceutical companies. So it's interesting that they know all of this. And to me, it's business, because I'm going to throw you in an example of how big a business it is and how scared they get if anything is going to disrupt it. Just a few years ago, a physician from Great Britain by the name of Wakefield, W-A-K-E-F-I-E-L-D, who is a gastroenterologist for children. He's a pediatric gastroenterologist. Over time, he had several of his patients come to him and say, you know, I noticed something strange, and I wonder if you know if there might be some connection. What they noticed was that after their child was vaccinated with the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, that they developed a lot of gastrointestinal problems. And after they developed a lot of gastrointestinal problems, many of them started developing autistic symptoms. So they asked Dr. Wakefield, do you think there's a possibility there could be a relationship between the vaccine and the gastrointestinal problem and the autism? So he said, I don't know, but it would be worth looking into. So he and a group of other doctors ended up going back and doing what's called a meta-analysis of hundreds of patients that they had seen, and that what had happened before and after having been vaccinated with the MMR vaccine. When they completed their study, they felt that there was enough evidence to suggest further studies that there could be a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and the gastrointestinal problem and the autism. So this group of doctors, headed by Dr. Wakefield, wrote up a paper and presented it to the Lancet, which is the most prestigious worldwide organization, or publishing, I should say, journal of medicine. In other words, the Lancet is the one for the whole world. In this country, it's the Journal of the American Medical Association and the AMA journal are the two biggies, but for the whole world, including the U.S., the Lancet is the place to publish. Now, they have what's called a peer review committee, which means that they have a group of doctors who have expertise in the subject that's being talked about. In this case, it was gastroenteritis and so forth. So they reviewed this paper that was written by this group of doctors, headed by Dr. Wakefield. When they looked at it, they said, yes, it appears that there's enough evidence that suggests further studies. They didn't say, we've proven absolutely that it causes it. They said, yes, the paper is asking for further studies, and we believe that the paper should be published because it's pointing out the possibility of a problem, and there's sufficient evidence to suggest that it's true. Now, listen to these words. Could be, maybe, suggest. In no case did he say, yep, we've proven it caused it. Okay, once that paper was published, there was an uproar. Okay, now, interestingly, the uproar came from the British Medical Journal. Okay, now the British Medical Journal is another one that's headed by several people in the medical field, and they all of a sudden attacked Dr. Wakefield. They started telling all these stories that he was fraudulent, that he was doing all this to make money, that he had a terrible character, and I mean, they just went on and tried to destroy him, and I think he ended up having trouble even with his license and his medical board because of all this stuff that was published, where the people that spearheaded this attack from the British Medical Journal, Dr. Wakefield didn't take it lying down. He went and hired investigators, and they found out one thing real fast, that the person who spearheaded it from the British Medical Journal had financial ties to the pharmaceutical company who produced the vaccine. And he had developed proof that they lied about him. So, he now has a major lawsuit against those people and the British Medical Journal for publishing false information, lying, and not revealing that they had financial interest in the pharmaceutical that's producing the MMR vaccine. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that goes on today, and that's one of the things I'm leading you to, that in the background, people still like to believe, first of all, that pharmaceutical companies are in business to make money. I mean, make money, they are, but they think they're in business to help people. Now, it's okay if you make money if you're producing results with what you're marketing. I mean, I don't think anybody has qualms about a company making money if they're producing a product that's useful and people get value out of it. There's nothing wrong with them making money at that. Nothing at all. But when they make massive amounts of money and they produce defective or inferior products to it that does not give you the result that you're paying for, then I think it's time to question what's going on. And so we won't get into the whole vaccination issue again, other than to say that is one of the problems of where we've gotten to, is the pharmaceuticals have gotten into a position, they have enough money to influence, and unfortunately, including the FDA. Now, if you look at this Pure Food and Drug Act that I wanted you to be aware, that was published in that was established in 1906. June the 30th, 1906, the first Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. It wasn't long before, again, the food processors were back. Now, they had stalled this off for a long time. But when the president got behind it and he started revealing to the public the nature of the contamination, then the Congress had to go ahead and pass it. He had enough influence to get it passed. But it wasn't long before the influences still were back. And so they pushed, in essence, Dr. Wiley out of the director because he was confiscating huge amounts of adulterated food. And that was costing him money. So they didn't like that. So they all got together and put the pressure, and eventually he was out of there. But over time, it got changed bit by bit and became ultimately, around the late 30s, it was changed from the Pure Food and Drug Act to the Federal Drug Administration Act. And that is now what we know as the FDA. Now, unfortunately, they, over the years, have actually, instead of them regulating the food processors and the pharmaceutical industry, in essence, they protect them now. If somebody comes along with something that is a non-drug that might be competitive, the FDA is right out there to try to stop it or shut them down. But they let drugs come on the market that are terrible in terms of effects, and one in particular. I mean, I've got some lists here of the 15 dangerous drugs Big Pharma shoves down our throats. The dirty dozen of dangerous drugs. I mean, a lot of those drugs are life-threatening that they're putting out, and they're not ever getting you well. It's there for management. So you're going to take this stuff forever unless it kills you first. So anyhow, all of this stuff is coming out, and one in particular, which is one of the more recent ones, and I'm sure you heard of it, and I remember when they were talking about it, they were hoping to get it approved, which was something called a COX-2 inhibitor, and Vioxx was one of the big ones. And I heard even doctors, oh boy, this is going to be great because aspirin, you know, has a lot of adverse effects, like it can cause bleeding ulcers and it can erode away the lining of the stomach and so forth, and it has other toxic effects, including the liver. But it's what's called a COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitor, and we don't have time to go into what does that all mean. But it means basically that one has to do with fevers and the other has to do with inflammatory reactions from the immune system. And so what they wanted to do was a drug that turned off the inflammatory process and not have other adverse effects in the body. So they came out with this group of called COX-2 inhibitors, and I heard all these doctors saying, boy, this is going to be great when we get these out, blah, blah, blah. And so I said they're going to kill a lot of people with it. Because I remember when it was being talked about, it was not approved to get on the market, and I said, I'm going to kill a lot of people with it, because when you start shutting down the immune system, you're going to have big trouble in the body. So anyhow, they came on the market, and lo and behold, people started having terrible health problems and dying. Now, you know, if a competitor from herbs or nutrients or whatever comes on the market, or has been on the market, and is starting to bite into the pharmaceutical business, in my mind, I'm giving you my opinions, they go to the FDA and complain. This company is, or this product is cutting into our business. So what do? The FDA starts watching them, and if they can find any single incident where they might connect, I don't say they could connect, but they might connect, an herb with some kind of a symptom, they're going to pull it off the market. And an herb in particular was chaparral. Chaparral was used for years. It's a very powerful drug and lymph cleaner, anti-cancer in the sense that it's a big, strong immune booster, and so forth. They found one case where somebody took a lot of chaparral and they had an inflamed liver. Now, there were no studies that proved that the chaparral inflamed the liver, but they used that as an example to pull the chaparral. One case, maybe. And the person didn't die, they just had inflamed liver. There was an elevation of liver enzymes. Vioxx comes on the market, and lo and behold, a lot of bad things start happening. And finally, a lot of people are dying with it. But it went on and on and on, and finally, by the time the FDA said, we're going to have to pull that, all kind of bad press was out there. And 150,000 people, it's now estimated, died from taking Vioxx. 150,000. Now that's a lot of people. But it took that many deaths before it got pulled from the market. Now I don't know if this is clicking or not, but and you know what? The drug companies knew it. They knew it in advance, and they withheld the information that all these deaths were occurring from it until the press picked up on it and it became so well known that couldn't be hidden anymore. Then it was pulled from the market. Now a lot of drugs, I mentioned before Tambacor, which came on the market, and there's a book out on it. An investigative reporter really looked into it because there were a lot of deaths occurred from it. And that particular drug, it came out on the market, and it was an antiarrhythmic drug, and 50,000 people, if you can find the book, I don't happen to have it handy with me right now, but if you can find the book, 50,000 people approximately dropped dead pretty fast once it was released on the market. And, however, it was kept out of the press. And so the drug is still on the market. It never was pulled. But in the PDR, you see under the black letters, you know, these are kind of little alerts for the doctor. It says, caution, excessive mortality has been related to this drug. You know, it's a kind way of saying it killed a lot of people. But it's still out there, and it's still being prescribed for people. You know, they say anywhere from 150 to 250,000 people die every year from prescription drugs. Nobody really knows, because the only way they would know is that it gets reported. And if it's not reported, nobody knows. Well, they can attribute the death to anything they want once a person dies, and who's going to object? And so it happens all the time, and it doesn't get reported. Now, the Center for Disease Control, sometime back I was looking at it, and they were talking about adverse events reporting for vaccines, for vaccinations. And they quoted a period of time, and they said there were 45,000 cases reported to them of adverse events related to vaccines during this period of time. 45,000. Now, they said, however, we are convinced that only about 10% actually get reported. That's what they said. I didn't say that. The CDC said it. They said about 10% likely get reported because it may not happen immediately after the immunization. It may be the next day or a few days. And the doctor, even if he thinks that it's caused by the immunization, you think he wants to report that in case that he gets sued, that he's already acknowledged that there was a relationship between the vaccine and the problem that the child has. So you think he's going to go ahead and report it? If he can avoid it, he's going to. And the same thing is if adverse drug effects. If 10% only get reported with the vaccine, you can bet only 10% get reported with the other. So if people are saying 150 to 250,000, and that's only 1/10, then we're talking maybe $1.5 million to $2.5 million. So we've got a big problem. We don't really know. We don't know for sure how many. A lot are. Many more than what people would think. And so there's organizations that are watching this stuff, but nobody hears about it. They don't get any press. And they're tracking all this stuff, like this Consumer Reports, and I consider them pro-medicine. The consumerreports.org has wrote, "Are prescription drugs safe?" Not necessarily. The Food and Drug Administration approved them, yet your doctor prescribes them, and you see them advertised on TV, so your medications must be safe, right? Then why is Consumers Union bothering to publish alerts about drug hazards? More than half of all prescription drugs cause adverse effects, some serious or fatal. Now, I think that that's understating. It's much more than... There is no prescription drug that does not have some type of adverse effects. By the nature of the drug, it's shutting down something in the body, and in order to shut something down, you create adverse effects. Some serious or fatal that aren't detected until after the FDA approves them, sometimes many years later. Such delayed detection contributes to the high number of drug-related injuries in the U.S. In 2008 alone, the FDA received more than 100,000 reports of serious injuries related to adverse drug events, an increase of about 25% over the previous year, according to the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. Some of the delay is inevitable. It's simply not possible to detect every risk before doctors start prescribing a drug. Doing so would require clinical trials that would be prohibitively large, long, and costly. Now, I heard a guy from one of the drug representatives he was like a PR man from the drug industry, and he said, well, people, if they want these drugs out there, they just have to expect that, that there's going to be a lot of problems and a lot of adverse things happen, but that's what they have to live with if they want the drugs. And so he says, in addition, the U.S. system for identifying drug risk before approval is flawed. Now, that's what this Consumer Report said, not me. And the one for spotting them afterward is even worse. The 2007 FDA Amendments Act promised many changes in the drug safety system, but whether they will be sufficient, even if the agency uses its new powers effectively, remains to be seen. And then they go into more detail. Now, you can get this. You can. It was called consumerreports.org and Are Prescription Drugs Safe? Now, you can get on there and find out not only about it in general that I'm reading you, but also a lot of other stuff. They've got a lot of other specific things here in terms of 5 drugs you might want to skip, 10 drugstore surprises, ADHD drug shortage and anemia drugs, are drugs coated stents safe, blah, blah, blah. It goes through a whole list of things, plus and minus. Now, as I say, I always consider Consumer Reports to be pro-medicine and against natural things, but nonetheless, they still are offering this critique and says that holes in the pre-approval process, bigger holes after approval. Now, if you understand that when a drug finally gets approved, it goes through a certain number of steps. First of all, they do it, they have a suspicion from chemical research that a drug might shut down a particular pathway in the body, therefore blocking a certain symptom. Okay, so that makes people feel better, but of course it didn't correct the problem. So as time goes on, they decide that, well, you know, this probably could be a good drug to market. So they start to apply to the FDA for a process of approval for this particular drug, and then they start a series of studies. So they go through effectiveness studies, detrimental studies. At some point they have to do something before the drug can go on the market called an LD50 study, which means how much of this drug in milligrams or micrograms per kilogram of body weight in an animal will kill 50% of those animals. And that's what LD50 means, lethal dose 50. And so that has to be done. And of course, I mentioned at some other time there was a big scam about that. A company was supposed to do those studies. Ended up they were faking it. They never did the studies at all. And so a pile of drugs are on the market that never went through the LD50 studies. It was all phony report, and the FDA was aware of it. It was reported to them, but they just kind of glossed it off and never bothered to look into it or have any additional studies done on all those drugs that had been approved by the reports from this company who was not doing the testing. Anyhow, the LD50 studies have to be done, and from that they estimate what the dose range will be for somebody to take. Then at the tail end they have what are called limited human trials. So they take a rather limited group of people, not high in number, and they have them take the drug at different doses and so forth to kind of get some general guidelines. And then if the FDA, and now the FDA doesn't do any of this. This is all done by the drug company that wants the drug approved. They do all the studies. They gather all the information. And then they turn in a report to the FDA. The FDA looks over the report, and based on the drug company's studies, they decide whether they're going to approve the drug to be marketed. Once the drug is marketed and it goes out for general prescription, then they get into something called the post-release trials. Okay, now the people who rush out to get a new drug don't realize that they are now part of that drug study because they don't know what it's going to do across a large spectrum of people. And so it goes on the market, and then a lot of people start taking it. A lot of people are prescribed it, like did Vioxx, the COX-2 inhibitor. They started, the doctors, wow, a new drug, we're going to give this to all of our patients now. So they take them off all the other drugs that were similar and put them on this new drug. Okay, so now that's when they find out what the drug really does to people. Okay, so all these people are taking this drug, and some of them start having terrible adverse effects or dropping over dead. You know, like with the Tambicor, 50,000 of them fell over dead. That was the post-release trial. But did it get taken off the market? No, because it didn't hit the press. Nobody ever heard about it, except the people who dropped dead and this investigative reporter who wrote about it. But was his book on the best-selling list? Of course not. Did it ever get promoted? Of course not. Nobody wants to talk about that. So the drug is still out there, and it's still being given to people, and they're still dropping dead with it. But that's okay. But as I said, if one herb might have hurt somebody, might, not any proof, but it might have, pull it off the market. Can't have it out there. But really, it's part of that whole process of getting things out. Now, we don't really have time to get into all the details about the drug industry, how it works, and all that. But I want to give you a few examples before we get out of here that I want you to keep in mind, if you take nothing away from this, is that most of the illnesses or diseases that people talk about today and are being treated for with management drugs, not cures, but management drugs, most of those symptoms are deficiency symptoms. So now you've got a food problem. And just because, as I mentioned before, foods are grown organically does not mean that they are good for you, because if they're grown in bad soil, they've been grown without pesticides, even if they've done all these things, it still doesn't have the nutrients in it. If it doesn't have the nutrients in it, your body's going to be deficient. Now, the studies way back found out that the best way to get those nutrients in the body is in the food that's grown in good soil. Now, when somebody has a deficiency disease, such as a cardiovascular problem, what they found, and this book that I told you I got all the way from Australia, but it was actually from this country, The National Malnutrition by Dr. Quigley, he said that at the beginning, when you start to try to correct somebody, now he's saying this as a doctor, you not only have to get them on food that's grown in good soil that does have the nutrients, but to speed up the process of them getting well, you're going to have to give supplements for a while, and he's talking about good supplements. You're going to have to take good supplements for a while to speed up the process to help you get back on your feet and get the body recharged so that then you can get well. But if you do that, now this, he's talking back in the 40s, early 40s, from work done way back in the 30s. And so all of this, it seems that period of time around the 20s to 30s, there was a big awareness about the fact that the soil was depleted. Now, I'm not saying all soil was depleted, but the commercial growing soils were depleted. They just kept growing and throwing some ammonia and throwing a few key minerals so the plant would grow, and it looked nice, but when you bite into it or do an analysis of it, nothing's there. That was known by the Department of Agriculture. It's been known since that period of time. And now, in the 60s, they did a new set of studies on commercially grown foods. And they found that the vegetables and fruits in the 60s were already 50% less than they were in the 30s. And they were low back then. So you can imagine what the condition is now. In fact, 2 or 3 years ago, they started doing some studies, and I think if they're doing them, I can't find any information, but the first preliminary studies were showing that today it's even worse than it was in the 60s. So it's just a bad, bad problem, and we're addressing it from the wrong end, and it's costing us $1 trillion to address it. If you took the #1 cause, supposedly, of death today is cardiovascular problems. Cardiovascular problems was clearly pointed out back in the 30s as caused by malnutrition, depletion of the elements from the soil. And when I'm saying elements, I'm talking about minerals. The minerals were not there. And I don't have time, when we talk sometime about agriculture and growing, we'll talk more about that specifically. But the fact is, once you pull the minerals out, they're gone, and you don't do something to replenish them, then you're just growing in lifeless soil. And there's a lot of implications for that. So this doctor was saying, even then, in the 40s, if you're going to get somebody well, you're going to have to supplement as well as get them on real food if you want to hurry and get through the process and get them back to health. Supplements alone did not do it. They found that in the 30s. If you just gave them supplements, it was not enough. You had to have them eating a base of real food with real nutrients in it. Today they've got the term nutrient dense. So you had to have nutrient dense food with a lot of vitamins and minerals. But everybody has ignored the minerals. Everybody talked about vitamins, but hardly anybody about minerals. And in the body, one of the big protectors, for example, if your body is inflaming for some serious problem or even cancer, to try to correct it, it is producing something called hydrogen peroxide. Okay, now, hydrogen peroxide is a powerful oxidizer, and it will break down cancer cells, it'll break down viruses, it'll break down cells that are dying off to get rid of them. The hydrogen peroxide does that. It's a powerful antioxidant. But healthy bodies have within them an enzyme called catalase, which immediately converts hydrogen peroxide to oxygen and water and gets rid of that that oxidant characteristic that is so powerful that it oxidizes. Okay, so just taking antioxidants in general isn't enough. This needs to be in the blood, it needs to be inside the cells, and it is in a healthy body. But in order to make catalase in the body, you not only need certain nutritional factors and proteins and so forth, but you need iron, which forms a molecule in catalase, a hemoglobin molecule is what it is, just like it's in blood. It needs to have a hemoglobin molecule with iron at the core, but the catalyst that allows that to take place, or helps it take place, is copper. Okay, number one, medicine doesn't even run copper on a routine blood test. They don't do serum copper. And if the iron is low, they just pump in more iron, but it can't be effective without the copper for a protection against things like cancer, and any other inflammatory thing going on in the body that the body's trying to correct something. Okay, so if the soil's depleted, which it usually is, of copper, then you've got a big problem. And that's what was in the book I told you about, soil, grass, and cancer. If copper's missing, the body has a big problem doing what it's supposed to do. Now, over the years, they talked about copper piping was out there. People were getting too much copper, probably because of their water piping being copper. So all the multiples they started leaving copper out of, and iron both. And so the two key things that are necessary for the body to take care of hydrogen peroxide. Now, inside the human cell, when it makes energy, hydrogen peroxide is one of the byproducts that the catalase in the cell has to break down. But if you don't have the copper and or the iron, you can't make that, and therefore the cell's damaged inside by the hydrogen peroxide. It acts as an oxidizer. So all these things have to come together, and you know, nature took millions of years to get to where it is, that everything worked the way it was supposed to work. When we think we can improve on nature, or when we try to get around nature, we create terrible problems. I mean, it always happens. Every time I hear some scientists say, well, we found a way to improve on nature, I know we got another problem coming. Okay, so here we're selling all this empty food, having no energy, no nutrients. People are getting sick, creating deficiency diseases that we call cardiovascular problems, cancer, arthritis, rheumatism, and ulcerations, and colitis, and blah, blah, blah. And so the deficiencies plus stress tear the body apart. And how do we handle it? We go looking for a miracle drug that's going to turn off those adverse symptoms so we don't feel bad. Now, eventually, when you shut down the immune system so that it doesn't work anymore, guess what? We don't have symptoms. You realize, and I've gone over it many times, and I'll keep emphasizing, the symptoms that you don't like is the immune system trying to get rid of a problem that shouldn't be there. If you turn off the immune system, you're going to feel okay until you're dead, basically. Because one day you're going to find the body full of cancer or some terrible problem that you didn't even know, because the immune system didn't react anymore, so therefore you had no symptoms, because every time you had a symptom, you took a drug that turned off the symptom, thinking you were better. And as I said, the extreme of it is that when somebody has an organ transplant and they put them on all these powerful immune-suppressing drugs, they feel great. No symptoms. They can eat anything, they can do anything, they have no symptoms. Now, the drug companies takes advantage of the fact that you are willing to pay a lot of money for symptom relief with an underlying presumption that when you don't have symptoms, you're better. They don't mind you believe that, just like they didn't mind that you thought cholesterol is a problem. Now, we talked about that before, and I'm not going to go into it again, but the evidence is out there, and you're going to see more and more of it surfacing till one of these days they won't be selling all of these drugs to reduce cholesterol, because the cat's out of the bag, and that it has nothing to do with cardiovascular problems. Cardiovascular problems is a deficiency disease, and it's aggravated by stress. So those are the two killers. If you have a terrible deficiency and you add stress on top of that, you're going to kill the person. You're going to get a terrible degenerative disease, and you're going to kill the person. Bottom line. And any drug that they put out there may temporarily suppress the symptoms, but at some point you're going to be wiped out with it. And you're going to be like so many people, and I'm not laughing at them, I'm laughing at the situation, that you're going to be pulling a tank of oxygen and driving your electric wheelchair around, and that's not what I would really call living or health. I mean, that's not a pleasant way to have to live. And I'm not blaming the people, because they've been led down the path. And I keep mentioning the Wizard of Oz and the old man behind the curtain. We're looking at something that's presented to us on the TV screen and thinking this is what it is, and the guy in the background that's manipulating all that behind the curtain, the wizard, we don't notice him, and he doesn't want us to notice him. You just look at the screen. So if you've got some gastric distress and you see this ad, the purple pill, you know, then you run to your doctor and say, I need the purple pill. You take it and it turns off the acid in your stomach, so you can't digest your proteins anymore, which you weren't doing well anyhow, or you wouldn't have had the reflux and all the stuff that goes with it. And so you go to the doctor, he gives you a pill, you don't feel the reflux anymore. Does that mean that you are now well? Of course not. What it really means is that you're making yourself sicker, and you're going to be back for the next more powerful drug, because now you're going to have a worse problem. If you're deficient in protein, a new set of problems develop. You think you've gotten a new disease, and you have. You are now not at ease, but it was caused by the fact you didn't take care of the original problem, which was not enough acid. So it just goes on and on and on. So I'm hoping, and I guess the big thing that bothers me the most is the way that the drug companies actually misrepresent. If they test a particular product, and that product has some tests that look like, well, it might stop these symptoms, and then others say, well, no, it doesn't really that much. I mean, it's not much, it's not even above placebo. They eliminate all those studies and only show the ones that actually look favorable so they can put the drug on the market, but they do a lot of other things. And they actually misrepresent their own research sometimes. And I have here a copy of a suit that was brought in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, and it was brought by two researchers from the Merck company. Now, I can mention it because this is public knowledge. I went online and printed out a copy of the lawsuit, so it's public knowledge. It was brought against Merck, and it says this case is about Merck's effort for more than a decade to defraud the United States with respect to the efficacy of Merck's mumps vaccine. Now, I didn't say that. It's in the suit. You can get on and you can print out a copy just like I did. It was filed August 27, 2010 in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, United States District Court. Specifically, in an effort to maintain its Food and Drug Administration approval and exclusive license to sell the vaccine, Merck has used improper testing techniques and falsified test data to fabricate a vaccine efficacy rate of 95% or higher. This is the efficacy threshold on which the FDA insists that its licensing and approval of the vaccine. In truth, the efficacy rate of the Merck's mumps vaccine is and has been since the least 1999 significantly lower than the requisite threshold. Now, what happened? These two people did the research, and then when they turned it in, Merck changed the numbers and put the pressure on them to keep their mouth shut if they wanted to work there. And because of their own personal integrity being on the line, they quit Merck. And when they quit, they went out and filed this complaint for violations of the Federal False Claims Act. And because of the fact that the government now was shamed, because they already knew this, because these people had reported it and the FDA came in and did a hand slap and let it go, they were so upset that they left and filed the suit. Now the United States of America also has joined in this suit. But these two people originally are the ones that went out to bring the suit. So anyhow, this is the kind of thing that happens. I know we're out of time. There was a doctor in Europe that was very specialized, and so one of the drug companies went to him and said, we want you to do some studies on this drug. And so he took the drug and he did his studies, and when it was all done, he looked at the data and said, it's no good. He turned it back over to the drug company, and lo and behold, the next thing he knew, the drug was approved and being marketed on the basis that his research showed it to be effective. And he was furious. He came over to the U.S. and tried to get his material back, and they refused to give it back to him. He went to court, and the court said, well, You can't have a DAC. They paid for it, but you can go look at it. And so in the meantime, they had taken the same data out and had another doctor in this country sign it that he did the study, and they had eliminated all the bad information and only presented the good information. Now, getting back to what I said earlier, the FDA does not do the study on the drug. The pharmaceutical seeking approval does their own research, and based on material they furnish, that's how the drug gets approved. Now, I want you to think about all this. Am I saying there's never a case for a drug in some emergency situation temporarily? No. Am I saying there's never a case for surgery? No. Am I saying all doctors are bad? No. There's a lot of doctors who go into medicine to help people, but there's a lot that go into medicine as a business. And those doctors are going to play the game, and whatever the drug company comes out with, they're going to be handing it out in force, and many of them are going to get paid a little extra money for doing that, or even extra money for speaking how great it is, so other doctors will make use of the drug. There's just a whole marketing regime going on, and who's paying the bill? We are, the public. We're paying for all this, like in the vaccines. If the company or the government court, which is the only place you can make your complaint, if you can prove your case, they have a cap on them, but they have paid out several hundreds of millions of dollars already for claims that were proven beyond a doubt. But we paid the price. You know why? Because they put a surcharge on the vaccine that's paid for by the people who buy the vaccine, not the pharmaceutical. So they not only, you can't sue them, but they don't even have to pay for any damage. We get to pay for it after we paid for the product in the first place. And I hope this is sinking in, not just about the drug companies, but all the useless drugs that are out there to treat deficiency symptoms that could be corrected if we correct the soil and correct the food in the first place. That's the problem. So I leave that with you, and later we'll be talking about some things you can do, maybe, to determine whether the food you're buying has any value or whether it's poor garbage. Pure garbage, I mean. Shouldn't say pure, impure garbage. Doesn't have anything in it. It was nice to be with you again. I want you to continue to go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and you can click from that website. There's a link that takes you over to Alternative Health and Prevention, which talks a little bit about my office and what I do otherwise. It was nice to be with you again. You can go on our forum page and ask questions, make comments. You can criticize. As I tell you, this is my opinion, but I'm giving you resources. You go out. Don't forget the book, Selling Sickness, by Moynihan, how the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies are turning us all into patients. I told you that at the very beginning. Seeking Sickness, Medical Screening, and The Misguided Hunt for Disease. Dr. Bregan on the psychiatric drugs. Your drug may be your problem. How and why to stop taking psychiatric medications. Overdiagnosed. This guy's a graduate of Yale, taught psychiatry. Overdiagnosed, making people sick in the pursuit of health. Overtreated, why too much medicine is making us sicker and poorer. Politics and Healing, the suppression and manipulation of American medicine. How we do harm by a major doctor involved with the National Institute of Cancer, has gotten educated in seeing what's happened in the whole field and how we really are harming people. We are done. We will be seeing you again in our next broadcast. Otherwise, be healthy.